the necessity of aerial intelligence predated the airplane itself. Commanders understood that the only way to truly comprehend the battlefield was to rise above it. This truth was cemented by World War I. Observation pilots, flying slow, fragile machines, were essential for artillery spotting and map-making. They distributed over 500,000 photographic prints to Allied forces. But this vital mission came at a staggering cost. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, listed 45 observation aircraft among his 80 kills. This was a grim testament that reconnaissance was often synonymous with a death sentence. Despite this bloody validation, the American military entered the interwar period with deep institutional myopia. The perception that two vast oceans provided immutable defense led to a devastating decline in funding. The U.S. Army Air Corps languished, relying on outdated equipment and tactics. These tactics would have been laughable to the German or British high commands. The future of American reconnaissance was not saved by a general or a strategic committee. It was saved by Dr. Tipple George W. Goddard, a tireless scientist working in obscurity. Assigned to McCook Field in 1919, Goddard became the singular driving force behind technological advancement. He was a pioneer who understood that survival depended on seeing more faster and from farther away. Goddard developed the long focal length lenses necessary for high-altitude work. He revolutionized night intelligence with early flash mechanisms. He even pioneered infrared photography. These were technologies the U.S. military would urgently need decades later. Goddard engineered the Bagley K3 triple-lens camera. He also helped design the Fairchild F-1A, the first Army aircraft conceived purely for photographic intelligence. But bureaucratic inertia was immense. It took the cataclysmic shock of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, to force a rapid critical re-evaluation. The foundation of what would become the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group was laid just months before the attack. This occurred on September 1, 1941, with the activation of the 73rd Observation Group in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The unit's beginning was defined by a chaotic lack of resources. Commanding officers Major Edgar Scattergood and Technical Sergeant John Pettigrew found themselves with no supplies and little equipment. Personnel was simply encouraged to keep busy. It was an ambitious assignment, with zero infrastructure. It was here that Private Louis Stapp designed the unit crest. The crest was named Argus, watching over the world, bearing the motto, Ceaseless Watch. The men relocated to Godman Field, Fort Knox, Kentucky. There, the grim reality of their mission began to sink in. They trained using aircraft that were already obsolete. These included the lumbering O-47s and O-52s. These planes were designed for casual observation, not survival in modern airspace. Aerial observer Newton E. Jard recounted a typical, harrowing mission. It illustrated the pathological danger inherent in their slow, vulnerable machines. Flying in cold, snowy New York weather, Jard and his pilot were forced down to 50 feet altitude. Heavy snow had smothered visibility. With the fuel gauge hovering near empty, less than 5 minutes remaining, the pilot attempted a desperate landing on a highway. The O-47 rolled down the asphalt, narrowly missing an oncoming automobile and a tree. It finally smashed into a telephone pole. The aircraft was washed out, reducing the unit's O-47 inventory by half in a single terrifying instant. The necessity for change was underscored by these continuous losses. This was true not just in accidents, but during the rigorous Tennessee maneuvers between April and October 1943. These exercises served as a critical, if costly, proving ground for new tactical concepts. The shift in doctrine was immediate and unforgiving. The age of the leisurely observation plane was over. The future belonged to fast, specialized fighter aircraft. This realization led to the redesignation of the 15th Observation Squadron to a tactical reconnaissance unit. They were re-equipped with P-39 fighters. The new manual, formalized by Major William B. Reed, emphasized that fighter reconnaissance pilots must be thoroughly impressed with the fact that they are fighter-trained as well as reconnaissance-trained. By late 1943, the impending invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, was looming. The U.S. Military High Command determined that the existing 73rd Group headquarters was excess to operational needs. It was slated for disbandment. This decision was intercepted by Colonel Bill Reed. Reed was a man deeply invested in the organization he had helped build. Determined to save his unit, Reed embarked on a high-stakes journey to Washington, D.C. on December 30th, 1943. He cornered the Deputy Chief of Staff, passionately arguing for the unit's superior qualifications and potential. When asked if his organization could function as a dedicated photo group, Reed seized the moment. This was a completely new designation, focused solely on detailed photographic intelligence. He declared their instant capability with a confident, though perhaps premature, boast. He stated, "We are experts in aerial photography." Reed's lobbying paid off. His intervention led to the re-establishment of the unit as the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group headquarters. The 73rd Observation Group, a chaotic, under-equipped collection of dedicated men, was dead. In its place stood the 10th PRG, formally designated and organized. It was ready to deploy to the European theater of operations. The new unit was now armed with the specialized doctrine and the technological groundwork laid by Dr. Doctrine Groundwork, Goddard. They departed for England on January 24, 1944. They carried the immense responsibility of providing the life-saving intelligence that would determine the success of D-Day. By February 21, 1944, the newly designated 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group headquarters was established at Chalgrove, England. This marked its formal entry into the European theatre of operations. Colonel Bill Reed's lobbying had secured their existence. Now the unit faced the true test. They had to provide the photographic intelligence that would define the largest amphibious invasion in history. The stakes were immediate and immense. The 10th PRG was quickly integrated into the 9th Air Force to handle tactical support. They traded their obsolete observation planes for the sleek, twin-boomed Lockheed F-5 Lightnings. These were unarmed photo variants of the P-38 fighter. Their initial tasks involved high-altitude mapping runs. They flew between 29,000 and 35,000 feet to cover vast swaths of enemy territory. These missions were successful, charting new airfields and providing essential bomb damage assessment. But as the planned D-Day invasion approached, it became terrifyingly clear that high-altitude mapping was insufficient. Allied commanders needed granular, intimate details of the German Atlantic Wall defenses. They needed to know the exact placement of steel hedgehogs, mined stakes, barbed wire, and concrete pillboxes. This information could only be captured from the deck of the ocean. This strategic necessity demanded a dramatic, high-risk pivot. It required the execution of the ultra-low-level dicing missions. The name itself suggested the risk. To dice meant to fly unarmed and unescorted through the most heavily defended airspace in Western Europe. Pilots skimmed the ground at altitudes sometimes as low as 25 feet. They captured oblique, close-up shots of coastal defenses from Dunkirk all the way to St. Vaast-la-Hougue. For the pilots, the assignment was viewed as suicidal. The first operational dicing mission over the French coast was flown on May 6, 1944. Lieutenant Albert Lanker flew his F-5. Lanker flew his specialized Lightning, polished for maximum speed and stripped of non-essential weight, directly into the jaws of the German defenses. He reported flying so low that he surprised several groups of German workmen constructing obstacles on the beaches. Lanker recounted, "I headed straight for every group, just to watch them scatter and roll." The pilots tasked with these missions were not engaging in dogfights. They were running a gauntlet of small arms fire and light flak. They were relying entirely on speed and nerve against the relentless, blinding rush of the ground beneath them. The critical nature of the work escalated rapidly. Between May 6th and May 20th, the 10th PRG executed its most hazardous missions. They provided the raw material for the invasion planners during a subsequent series of low-level runs on May 19th. Pilots like Lieutenant Alan R. Keith faced chaotic environments. His mission was abruptly aborted when a seagull smashed through his plexiglass canopy. This was a shocking reminder of the physical impossibility of the speed at which they were operating. The cost was immediate. Lieutenant Fred F. Hayes was lost during his dicing mission. He was a casualty of the uncompromising demand for intelligence, yet the results were undeniable. The meticulous close-up photos delivered by the 10th PRG provided Allied commanders with essential, life-saving knowledge. They needed this information to brief the troops and execute the landings. The aerial images allowed engineers to identify weaknesses. Planners calculated tidal obstructions. Commanders pinpointed the most effective landing zones. It was indisputable validation of the specialized, dangerous work of reconnaissance. The myth that their role was routine or secondary to combat was shattered forever. Major General Vandenberg, head of the 9th Air Force, later formally recognized the incredible sacrifice and dedication of the pilots. He commended the unit's extraordinary skill, fortitude, and gallant devotion to duty. The men of the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group had successfully delivered the intelligence needed for the largest military operation in history. The stage for D-Day was set. The immediate aftermath of D-Day did not bring the swift liberation the Allies had envisioned. Instead of a fluid advance, the American and British forces found themselves locked in a brutal, grinding battle. They fought entrenched German defenders in the suffocating terrain of the Normandy bocage. The ancient hedgerows created a maze of natural fortifications. They concealed German armor and infantry, turning every field into a deadly, individual fortress. This stalemate was exacerbated by relentless pro-Nazi weather. The weather often grounded the heavy bombers and limited ground visibility. This placed an immediate and immense burden on the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group. High-altitude photo mapping was useless. Commanders needed real-time, granular intelligence. The 10th PRG was now fully integrated into the 19th Tactical Air Command. They utilized the heavily armed F-6 Mustangs for tactical reconnaissance, or TAC-R. They were tasked with flying continuous, low-level visual patrols. These missions were no longer just about photography. They were about fighting for information. The new doctrine, emphasizing that pilots must be fighter-trained as well as reconnaissance-trained, was tested daily. The pilots flew armed reconnaissance runs. They were often tasked with assessing the damage inflicted on key targets. This job required diving into flak zones repeatedly. In July, the front remained static. The Allies attempted to sever German supply lines by destroying bridges over the treacherous Loire River. Ordered to get pictures regardless of weather, Lieutenant Fred Trenner and Lieutenant Ernest Bud Schonard flew low. They hugged the ground beneath the overcast. During one run targeting a caved-in highway bridge near Samar, Trenner dove to the deck. He used his Mustang's guns to strafe a suspected flak tower. An exploding shell, bright orange in color, narrowly missed his ship. The sensory experience of flying through this man-made hell was visceral. The pilots were running a gauntlet of light flak and small arms fire just to confirm a bridge was broken. The constant low-level operations also meant that reconnaissance aircraft were highly vulnerable to opportunistic German fighters. On one mission near Cherasee, Lieutenants Joe Waits and John Meifert were jumped by enemy aircraft. They were forced into a desperate deck-level dogfight. They successfully coordinated their attacks to shoot down 2 Mi-109s. Other encounters were less fortunate. Near Avranches, Lieutenants Richard Doc Ewell and Frank Ristow found themselves ambushed by a massive gaggle of over 30 Mi-109s. Though Ewell managed to fight his way clear, Ristow's luck ran out. He was shot down and taken prisoner. This was a stark reminder that the cost of gathering intelligence was often the same as direct combat. The brutal stalemate finally shattered on July 25th. This occurred with the successful execution of Operation Cobra. This massive carpet-bombing operation ripped open the German line near Saint-Lô. This breach was not merely a tactical victory. It was a revolution in mobility. On August 1st, General George S. Patton's Third Army was activated. The subsequent advance was unlike anything seen on the Western Front. Patton's armored spearheads moved so fast that they constantly outstripped their own logistical support. They famously ran their tanks dry of fuel. Critically, they also outran their communications. Radio and landline intelligence, which relied on fixed command posts, instantly became obsolete. The entire burden of real-time battlefield awareness fell upon the fast, high-flying, and heavily armed F-6 Mustangs of the TAC-R squadrons. The mission ratio shifted radically. The need for instant visual reconnaissance dwarfed the need for traditional, centralized photo intelligence. The pilots became the eyes and ears of the spearhead commanders. They flew deep into enemy territory and reported instantly via radio. Lieutenant Raymond, flying an armed patrol near Amiens, spotted a German train loaded with armored vehicles. He immediately vectored in fighter bombers to destroy the invaluable cargo. Sometimes, critical intelligence was found by sheer accident. This demonstrated the constant coverage the TACR provided. Lieutenant James Matthews, flying off course in poor weather, unintentionally photographed Chalons. When the film was processed, it revealed a massive concentration of German railroad guns. These targets were subsequently obliterated by Allied artillery. A major threat that had been entirely unknown minutes earlier was silenced. This constant real-time flow of actionable intelligence was the indispensable key to the greatest success of the campaign. This was the encirclement of the German 7th Army. As Patton's Third Army swung south and east, the TACR pilots provided the critical data points. This allowed Allied commanders to gauge the speed, direction, and desperation of the fleeing German forces. The intelligence provided by the 10th Photo Group confirmed the trap was closing in the Argentan-Falaise Gap. This sealed the fate of tens of thousands of enemy troops. It validated General OPW's later assessment. He said the spectacular successes of the Third Army would not have been possible without the prompt and accurate observation of the reconnaissance units. The men of the 10th PRG had transitioned from invisible mappers to frontline combat intelligence agents. Their speed and courage forged the path for the Allied breakout and the rapid sweep across France. The stunning speed of the Allied advance came to an abrupt, grinding halt in the first days of September 1944. General Patton's tanks, having outrun every conceivable supply line, sat dry at the Meuse River. The front, which had been a chaotic, fluid chase across France, suddenly froze. This critical logistical crisis forced a necessary strategic shift. The days of relying on tactical reconnaissance to track fleeing, disorganized enemy columns were over. The focus now turned eastward, toward the implacable defenses of the German homeland. The intelligence gathered during the chaotic sweep across France had proven the indispensable value of air-ground coordination. This culminated in the recent, devastating airstrike guided by Lieutenant Fouquet. That strike led to the surrender of General Elster's entire command. General OPW Island, commanding the 19th TAC, noted that the air cover protecting Patton's flank was military history. But the next target required more than rapid pursuit. It demanded an atomical dissection of the enemy's prepared defenses. The new mission for the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group was nothing less than the systematic mapping of the Siegfried Line. They also mapped the heavily fortified fortress city of Metz. This strategic reconnaissance required staggering effort. The 31st Photo Squadron was tasked with comprehensive photo mapping of the entire corridor between the Moselle and Rhine rivers. They provided detailed blueprints of every fort in the Metz system. They also mapped every potential crossing point along the Moselle. The sheer scale of the operation was immense. It required the delivery of over 200,000 photographic prints to the Third Army Photo Center in a single 4-day period. The increasing proximity to the German border meant reconnaissance pilots were confronting the full fury of the Reich's evolving defenses. The flak, already notorious, became exponentially more dense and accurate. Pilots were now dodging anti-aircraft fire over targets like Sarreburg and Bingen. These defenses seemed specifically engineered to catch low-flying aircraft in a deadly, inescapable net. Lieutenant Lively's F-5 Lightning was hit so violently by flak over Bingen that the aircraft was flipped completely over. Yet, he somehow managed to nurse the heavily damaged ship back to base despite taking 20 hits. Near Saarburg, Lieutenant Brackett's Mustang returned riddled with 96 holes. The pilot survived a leg wound, thanks only to sheer luck and the Mustang's resilience. Pilots were also facing a terrifying new technological threat. This was the Me-262 jet fighter. Captain Robert Holbury was among the first to report being stalked by the revolutionary aircraft. It closed the distance at unimaginable speeds, indicating 350 miles per hour in a 45-degree climb. The jets forced an immediate critical development of new evasive tactics. The speed of the Me-262 meant a reconnaissance pilot could no longer rely on simple speed to escape. Instead, they had to rely on extreme repeated sharp turns. This forced the jet, which was less maneuverable at high speeds, to overshoot. It turned the engagement into a desperate high-G game of chicken. It was the exhaustive, detailed photo reconnaissance that ultimately paved the way for the next great victory. The assault on Metz, a fortress that had withstood sieges for centuries, was launched in the early hours of November 8. The success of the offensive was a testament to the meticulous work of the 10th PRG. Their photos enabled accurate, pinpoint artillery fire and effective fighter-bomber attacks. This included the use of napalm that hammered the fortifications. The intelligence confirmed massive German troop and armored rail movements. This allowed the 5th Infantry Division to launch a surprise night attack on November 18. The attack cut off the last escape route. Fortress Metz fell to US troops on November 19. This historical moment was directly enabled by the aerial intelligence that caught the German command utterly by surprise. As the days grew shorter and the weather worsened, making daylight operations impossible, the 10th PRG adapted once more. They leaned heavily on the revolutionary technology of night photography. The 155th Night Photo Squadron, utilizing the powerful Egerton lamp, proved its worth. It penetrated the darkness and delivered actionable intelligence that daylight pilots could never reach. One such critical mission was flown by Lieutenant W.A. Wolf. He captured an image of marshalling yards north of Stuttgart. When the film was processed, the results were astounding. The photograph revealed over 1,800 goods wagons. It also showed 15 engines with steam up and numerous aircraft dispersed on a nearby field. This single, crystal-clear image of the enemy's nighttime logistics was achieved by the flash of the Egerton lamp. It led to massive targeted airstrikes against the yard, choking a vital artery of German supply. The men of the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group had mastered the art of observation in every environment. This ranged from the deck of the ocean to the dead of night. They had mapped the enemy's wall. They guided the destruction of their ancient strongholds. They survived the introduction of the jet age, but even as the Allies celebrated the fall of Metz, the pilots were observing a disturbing increase in heavy rail and road movement across the front. This was a surge of activity that Army intelligence would tragically fail to fully comprehend until it was too late. The airmen were seeing the unmistakable preparations for Field Marshal von Rundstedt's final desperate gamble. The massive German Ardennes offensive, launched on December 17, 1944, was not merely a tactical shock, it was the catastrophic validation of a critical intelligence failure. For weeks, the pilots of the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group had been observing and reporting a disturbing surge in rail and road traffic along the front. This was the unmistakable preparations for Field Marshal von Rundstedt's final desperate gamble. But Army intelligence, blinded by institutional certainty and focused elsewhere, had tragically dismissed these warnings. When the enemy armored columns finally burst through the thin American lines, surprise turned into chaos. Generals Patton and Bradley desperately needed to know the enemy's speed, direction, and strength. Landlines and static command posts could not provide this information. The entire burden of regaining battlefield awareness fell instantly upon the tactical reconnaissance units. The pilots were thrust into a personal hell defined by brutal winter conditions. They were forced to fly determined, low-altitude missions through weather that often dropped the ceiling to 50 feet. Visibility was sometimes less than 100 yards. They were hunting for tanks in fog and snow. They flew at the deck to locate cut-off US troops and determine the exact positions of the German spearheads. Captain E.L. Bishop, flying reconnaissance over the Luxembourg sector, reported the sad situation of retreating American forces. This report helped spur Patton into committing the entire Third Army to the counterattack within 48 hours. The true turning point arrived on December 23rd. A miraculous mass of dry, stable air cleared the overcast. The weather shield that had protected the German advance was instantly eliminated. This laid the enemy's movement open to the relentless eye of Takar. Based on the intelligence gathered in those crucial, terrifying days, sustained aerial attacks commenced. The Takar pilots, now flying both armed reconnaissance and directing fighter bombers, provided the essential data points. This allowed Patton and Bradley to plan their counter-offensive and sustain the defense of Bastogne. As the new year turned, the pressure applied by the 19th TAC became unrelenting. It enabled Patton's Third Army to maintain its momentum and drive the Germans back. This intelligence-led pressure culminated in the systematic and devastating massacre of retreating German motorized units. This destruction started in late January 1945. The carnage was staggering. exceeding the destruction of the Falaise Gap. Pilots who flew these missions described flak so intense it seemed physically impossible to survive. Captain Robert Holbury, flying his F-5, described the anti-aircraft fire as red balls, about 3/4 the size of billiard balls, were arching around me. The constant, targeted destruction of German logistics and armor drove the systemic collapse of Army Group G. As the front compressed, the need for strategic mapping intensified. Lieutenant Russell Mickitan volunteered for a dangerous series of low-level missions to photograph German autobahns. This provided intelligence that allowed Allied forces to rapidly utilize the enemy's own infrastructure for their final push. By March 7, Third Army had completed a 50-mile dash to the Rhine. The strategic focus shifted to the final, fatal crossing. Reconnaissance became paramount, not just for mapping, but for pinpointing weak defensive points. The pilots faced extreme hazards from ground defenses and flak barges along the river. Lieutenant Halen R. Wood, attempting to attack a train, was struck by flak. He described it as feeling as if he had been blown apart. The shell ripped a gaping hole in his fuselage. The decisive Rhine crossing was executed on the night of March 22nd and 23rd at Oppenheim. It was a swift, strategic maneuver, heavily supported by 19th TAC intelligence. The crossing caught the shattered German command entirely by surprise. It accelerated the Reich's collapse. Once across, the Tok-Tok pilots became the eyes and the immediate strike force for the armored spearheads. On March 26th, Third Army captured Darmstadt and began throwing a ring around Frankfurt. Lieutenant Halen Wood and Lieutenant James Webb flew a critical reconnaissance mission near Limburg. Wood, observing an unsupported ground breakout by the enemy, radioed Central Control with a confident, urgent assessment. He declared, "The war can be ended here today." P-47 fighter bombers were dispatched immediately. They destroyed over 200 vehicles in the area. This was the ultimate validation of the reconnaissance doctrine. The TACR pilots had not only mapped the path across the Rhine, but had guided the immediate exploitation of the breach. The resulting breakthrough was the longest and fastest of the Third Army's campaign. It covered 100 miles in less than 3 days. This speed was made possible only by the constant real-time intelligence delivered from above. The end of the war was now a matter of weeks, not months. The final weeks of the European war devolved into a chaotic, rapid-fire chase. It was less a coordinated offensive and more a systematic dismantling of a dying empire. As the Third Army drove south and east toward Czechoslovakia and Austria in late April 1945, the missions of the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group reflected the complete collapse of German command structure. The tactical reconnaissance pilots, flying their F-6 Mustangs, were no longer primarily tasked with finding hidden targets. They were observing the wholesale disintegration of the enemy. The war became less about dogfights and more about traffic control. Pilots flew over highways choked not with organized convoys, but with thousands of dazed, retreating soldiers. These columns were often accompanied by massive groups of desperate civilians and displaced persons. The airmen became witnesses to the largest mass surrenders of the war. Resistance, though occasionally fanatical, was diminishing rapidly. The focus of Allied high command had shifted to the National Redoubt. This was the rumored final mountain fortress in Bavaria and Austria. Hitler and his most loyal SS troops were supposedly preparing a suicidal last stand there. Strategic planners feared that the redoubt could tie up Allied forces for another year. This would cost tens of thousands of lives, but the intelligence gathered by the 10th PRG proved the rumor was hollow. While the ground forces still encountered pockets of fierce resistance, the reconnaissance photos and visual reports revealed no massive stockpiles. They found no fortified mountain bunkers. There was no organized concentration of SS divisions preparing for a siege. The National Redoubt was a phantom, a myth sustained by propaganda and Allied fear. The tireless flights of the F-6 Mustangs confirmed the truth. The German resistance had crumbled. This was directly attributed to the relentless intelligence-led pressure applied by units like the 10th PRG over the preceding 12 months. By the first week of May, the 10th PRG was operating in a strange liminal space. The war was ending, but the threat remained. Lieutenant Wood and Lieutenant Chambers, during a reconnaissance mission over the southern thrust, engaged and destroyed two Stuka dive bombers. This occurred after a hectic chase through a valley. It demonstrated that the enemy's last pilots were still dangerous, if desperate. Then came VE Day, Tuesday, May 8, 1945. It was the strangest day of the entire conflict. The sky, once a deadly arena, became a bizarre parking lot. The final act of the German Air Force was a symbolic mass surrender. The TAC-R pilots turned into aerial cowboys, rounding up surrendering aircraft. German pilots, seeking to avoid capture by the Soviets, landed their remaining planes at Allied airfields across the continent. At one field, nearly 20 planes and 30 people landed, willingly escorted by the Mustangs. Most German airmen were relieved, waving white handkerchiefs in surrender. Yet the final flicker of defiance remained. Lieutenants Stanley Newman and Manuel Geiger forced down an Mi-109. Later, when a German pilot attempted a fast break on the runway, he was subdued by the ground crew. The last official aerial victory in the European theatre was scored that evening at 2000 hours by Lieutenant Robert C. Little. The war ended 4 hours later. The 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group had fulfilled its destiny. It lived up to the unofficial motto earned by its squadrons: first on D-Day, last on VE Day. The legacy of the 10th PRG was not confined to the wreckage of the Reich. The doctrine forged in the skies over Europe fundamentally changed modern warfare. This was the emphasis on high-speed, high-altitude photographic intelligence combined with real-time, low-level tactical observation. No longer was reconnaissance a secondary, slow and disposable mission. It was the indispensable first step. The methods perfected by Dr. Time, Goddard and the pilots of the 10th PRG became the foundation for strategic intelligence gathering in the decades that followed. These included advanced cameras, high-altitude flight, and dedicated analysis. 18 years after the fall of Berlin, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. In October 1962, the discovery of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba brought the United States and the Soviet Union to a terrifying standoff. The crisis was ultimately solved, not by tanks or bombers, but by the camera. The crucial evidence that allowed President Kennedy to confirm the threat and guide negotiations came entirely from high-altitude photographic reconnaissance missions. These were flown by U-2 spy planes. These missions were the direct technological and doctrinal descendants of the FF-5 Lightnings that flew over Normandy. They provided the irrefutable, detailed intelligence that prevented war. The men who flew the vulnerable unarmed photoships over France and Germany had not only guided the Allied armies to victory, they had, in effect, laid the groundwork for averting nuclear catastrophe. Their ceaseless watch had become the world's permanent eye.